This is a lecture on Al-Husri, Aflaq, and Nasser on the Pan-Arab Revolution. And so what we're going to look at in this lecture are three key figures of Pan-Arabism in terms of what I mean by key figures is not just in terms of political implementation, but in terms of theory and philosophy. And so in the case of Nasser, for instance, he was a major political figure, but he also was an important thinker. And we're mostly here interested in looking at the ideas that are present in the Pan-Arab movement or in what's known as Arabism. Now, this is a lecture intended largely for American undergraduates, although anyone who's listening to this is welcome to listen. But just to explain that I'm going to be dealing with some pretty basic concepts here. It's intended for newcomers to these issues and people who, an audience who by and large may not know that much about either Islam or Arabism. Now, one of the reasons why we want to survey these issues from, let's say, the perspective to make these ideas accessible to an American audience is because, as we all know, during the U.S.-led war on Iraq, during the George W. Bush era, there was a lot of misinformation spread that allowed the Bush presidents of the Bush administration to promote ideas about the Arab world, about leaders in the Arab world that were essentially not true or that were misleading. And so it was the uninformed nature of the American populace that led to a situation in which it was pretty easy to deceive Americans about what was really taking place in the Middle East at that time. And so I hope that if anything comes out of that for those listening to this, it is that you will have some sense of what the ideas are. Again, not to promote any particular political perspective, but just to gain a sense of what the issues really are so that you as a reader, as a listener, can judge for yourself or be in a better position to judge for yourself so that you're not easily misled by unscrupulous political leaders. If you know what the actual ideas are inherent in the debate surrounding some of these figures and their ideas, then it puts you in a better position to understand what's truly going on. And now what I mean by that is not just political Arabism, which is important, I think, for Americans to understand, just as about a basic matter of cultural literacy, but also the question of Islam, because many of these figures who were involved in Pan-Arab Revolution or Pan-Arab movement or political Arabism were found opposition within their own countries, within the Middle East, within the Arab world from Pan-Islamists. And so I want to, as we go through this, I want to think about these sort of two strands in the Middle East of Pan-Islamism, Pan-Arabism, and how they are essentially movements historically in the 20th century that developed in opposition to one another. I think it was precisely this knowledge that was missing in the American public that allowed for them to be misled in the case of the U.S.-led war in Iraq in 2003, what was at that time called Operation Shock and Awe. Okay, but again, this is for newcomers to these issues, so just a few basic things to bear in mind. We think about Middle Eastern language groups. In the year 2020, we have a number of different ethnic and language groups. We have the Persian people who speak Farsi in Iran. This is over 82 million people at present, and Muslims in Iran are largely Shiite rather than Sunni. The Arab population, Arabs are about 20 or 21 countries, depending on whether or not you count Palestine as an independent state. And we're talking about 423 million people at present who speak Arabic. And then the Turks in Turkey who speak Turkish, and there we're talking about 84.5 million people. And then, of course, another significant language group in the Middle East are the Israelis who speak Hebrew in Israel, and there you have about 8.7 million Israelis at present. Now, there are, of course, other language groups and ethnic groups in the region, the Armenians, who are largely Christians, the Circassians, who are Russians, who converted to Islam and then migrated for the most part to the region, the Kurds in Iraq, and Turkey, and parts of Iran, and the Amazigh, or the Berbers. So these are some other groups as well who are neither Arabic, Persian, Turkish, or Israeli. Now, as we look at this map here, on the left, you see the key countries in the Pan-Arab movement, or where there are significant Arab populations. They're not all Arabic populations. In some cases, you have, like, for instance, in the case of the Maghreb, you have the Berber populations as well. And in Egypt, you have Nubian populations, just to give you examples. Same is true of Libya. You have Black and Berber populations too. But these are the places that are predominantly, Arabic speaking, and where many Arab peoples live. Now, on the right, this gives you some sense of the distribution of Islamic communities. Some whom are Salafi, and what we can think of as Salafi pan-Islamism, the desire to unite the Middle East around religion, as opposed to the desire of the pan-Arab movement to unite the Middle East around a notion of Arabic identity, which in the case, for instance, of Edmund Rabat, as we explored in a previous essay, and the case of Al-Afghani is perhaps better thought of as not people who are ethnically Arabic, but who speak the Arabic language. But in any case, these are the two strands that we need to think about as we look at some of these ideas and some of the objections to the pan-Arab movement that were articulated by Salafists, by Islamists, particularly, for instance, in Saudi Arabia, the Wahhabi movement, those Muslims who were very opposed to the idea of a politics based on any kind of notion of Arab identity, or think of it, Salafism as a desire is driven in some sense by a desire to unite the Muslim world around the question of Islam, around the question of religion, rather than Arab ethnic identity. And so when we think, in this case in particular, we think of Sunni Islam, think of Wahhabism. The 80% of Muslims are Sunni. This is the largest articulation of Islam globally. And of that, there's a significant number who are Wahhabi. Now, we don't have time here to go too deep into the Wahhabi movement, but I'll just say in passing, this is a movement that took steam in Saudi Arabia, in what today is Saudi Arabia, in the 19th century. This is a very basic interpretation of Islam that tends to be iconoclastic and that is text-based, or promotes a notion of Islam that seeks, like, for instance, like the Protestant Christian tradition, to return to an Islam that was articulated in the days of the Prophet Muhammad, much like Protestant Christians wanted to, in the, say, like Calvin and Luther, return to an idea of Christianity as it flourished during the period of the Apostolic Church. Now, Salafism is not the same thing as Wahhabism, but they're closely related in terms of their interpretation of Islam, and neither are necessarily militant, although it's possible. Al-Qaeda, for instance, comes out of the Wahhabi movement and is extremely, and ISIS as well, these are extremely militant articulations of this iconoclastic fundamentalist interpretation of the Islamic religion. Now, these groups, if you're not familiar with these terms, you should look them up. You should know all these terms, and know also that these are that the Wahhabi movement, the Salafist movement, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, these are all elements within the Islamic world that were opposed, historically have been opposed to Arab identity politics, and were opposed to political Arabism, Baathism, and the pan-Arab movement in general, because they saw any kind of politics organized around the idea of Arab ethnic identity as in fact a form of heresy, and wanted to instead promote an idea of Islamic brotherhood. Now, Sati Al-Husri lived from 1880 to 1968, and he's a key figure in the pan-Arab movement. He grew up in the time of the Ottoman Empire, lived in the Ottoman Turkey, was a Syrian by birth, and also Iraqi, lived in Iraq. He was a strong proponent of the Pan-Arab movement, and also a proponent of the Pan-Arab movement who articulated a fairly eloquent refutation of those who promoted this pan-Islamism against a pan-Arabism. And here is what Al-Husri said. He said, every Arab-speaking people is an Arab people. All right. Now, that would include, for instance, Circassians, or it could be Armenians. It's, again, the emphasis falling on the question of language rather than, let's say, any sort of racial essentialism. Every individual belonging to one of these Arabic-speaking peoples is an Arab. And if he does not recognize this, and if he is not proud of his Arabism, then we must look for the reasons that have made him take this stand. He's thinking here again of, say, for instance, those that are in the Wahhab movement, emanating out of Saudi Arabia. It may be an expression of ignorance. In that case, we must teach him the truth. It may spring from an indifference or false consciousness. In that case, we must enlighten him and lead him to the right path. It may result from extreme egotism. In that case, we must limit his egotism. So he's not mincing any words here. And he says, but under no circumstances should we say, quote, as long as he does not wish to be an Arab, and as long as he is disdainful of his Arabness, then he is not an Arab, unquote. He is an Arab regardless of his own wishes. Whether ignorant, indifferent, undutiful, or disloyal, he is an Arab, but an Arab without consciousness or feeling, and perhaps even without conscience. And so in this case, the solution would obviously be education, to educate this person who is ignorant of his own Arab nature, his own Arab identity, and make him more aware of his identity as an Arab. So this is a very strong articulation of an Arab identity politics, which arises in the direct context of the pan-Islamist movement that wants to refute political Arabism. Now, Al-Husri, in his essay Muslim Unity and Arab Unity, he poses hypothetical questions to himself, the kinds of questions that pan-Islamists might pose to him, or perhaps actually did pose to him. Why, it is asked, he says, are you interested in Arab unity? Do you not see that the goal of Muslim unity is higher than the goal of Arab unity, and that the power generated by Muslim union would be greater than that generated by Arab union? Do you not agree that religious feeling is greater than national feeling? Do you not know that every Muslim in Syria, Egypt, or Iraq believes that the Indian Muslim, the Japanese Muslim, or the European Muslim is as much his brother as the Muslim with whom he lives side by side? Okay, so now these questions would be, again, the questions of those coming at it from this pan-Islamist perspective. That would be, say, the perspective of the Salafist, the perspective of the adherent to Wahhabism, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. You know, all of these movements, even Al-Qaeda, in a more extreme articulation of this view, this interpretation of Islam, all of whom would be opposed to Arab identity politics. And here is how Al-Husri responds to these questions. He says, we have to distinguish quite clearly between the question of Muslim brotherhood and Muslim unity. And we must consider whether it is possible to realize Muslim unity in the political sense. The Muslim world, within its present extensive limits, never at any time formed a political unity. If then political unity could not be realized in past centuries, when social life was simple and political relations were primitive, when religious customs controlled every aspect of behavior and thought, it will not be possible to realize it in this, the 20th century, when social life has become complicated, political problems have become intractable, and science and technology have liberated themselves from the control of tradition and religious beliefs. So now you might note there that one of the things that is characteristic of Arabism is, I won't use the word secular because it's not secular. It's not a secular movement or a liberal movement, as in separation of religion and state, in the sense that we might say in Holland or in France or in the United States in the First Amendment. It's more of an ecumenical movement, I think, rather than a secular movement. That is that there's an assumption of religious belief throughout those who belong to the pan-Arab movement or the Arabist political thought. But it's a question of not forefronting it. It's a question of sort of keeping the religion on the shelf in some sense. And the assumption is that everybody probably is going to be Muslim, a Sunni, or a Shiite, or a Christian. It's a world that is a very religious world, but it's setting it aside in the realm of the political, but not in a liberal sense. I want to make that point really clear. So he is articulating a view that he's saying, look, when was the Islamic world ever unified? This idea that there was Muslim unity is in some sense a myth. Now, again, if you're looking at it from the Wahhabi perspective and you're going back to this glorious time and the days and the time of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, there might have been this moment of unity at that time. But it's also important to remember that very shortly after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, the Islamic world fractured, and this is the beginning of the Shiite traditions. The word Shiite simply means sect, and so you already had a kind of a fissure that occurred very early on, and Al-Husri's underscoring this point, that there really never has been Muslim unity, and so to appeal to an idea of Muslim unity is in some sense a fantasy. So he's affirming Muslim brotherhood, but he's more skeptical about the idea of Muslim unity. He says, I repeat here, whoever opposes Arab unity on the pretext of Muslim unity contradicts the simplest requirements of reason and logic. And I unhesitatingly say that to contradict logic to this extent can be the result only of deceit or deception. The deception is that of the simple-minded who incline to believe whatever is said to them in the name of religion without realizing the hidden purposes that might lurk behind the speeches. Now, this, in some sense, he's not saying the same thing that Al-Afghani says, but he is promoting an idea of, he's arguing in favor of, reason as opposed to religious dogmatism, and he's skeptical about the motives of those who are promoting Islamism against Arabism and using the religion to perhaps deceive those who are not quite as sophisticated in their thinking. Whoever then charges that the idea of Arab unity is a foreign plot utters a greater falsehood than any that has ever been uttered, and he is the victim of the greatest of deceptions. We must know full well that the idea of Arab unity is a natural idea. So Al-Husri wants to insist that Arab unity is a natural idea. This is an idea very similar to the views of Prince Faisal, the first who saw in the very concept of the Arab, the very notion of the Arab, a very ancient idea that Faisal, for instance, linked to the figure of the Semite. And so the idea of what it means to be a Semite or a Shemite, son of Shem, daughter of Shem, is also synonymous, in effect, with what it means to be an Arab. And this is, for Al-Husri, something quite natural, regardless of one's religious affiliation. So again, the problem with pan-Islamism from this perspective is, let's say you're an Arab, but you're a Christian, or let's say you're a Shiite, and your interpretation of Islam is very different from that of the Muslim who is an adherent to the Wahhabi doctrine. And so Islam even itself has these fractures within it. So he sees more political potential in the idea of unity based around the concept of the Arab, an ecumenical concept that can bring together people of all different religious faiths and sects, as opposed to Islamism, which is going to exclude those who don't accept a particular interpretation of Islam. This is going to be Al-Husri's view. No one can logically pretend that it is the British who created the idea of Arab unity unless he can prove that it is the British who created the Arabic language, originating the history of the Arab nation and putting together the geography of the Arab countries. The idea of Arab unity is a natural concept springing from the depths of social nature and from the artificial views which can be invented, and not from the artificial views which can be invented by individuals or by States. Okay, now the context of this, it takes for those of us listening again in the United States, we need to take a minute here and unpack this. If we look at the Arab Revolt, now there I alluded in the lecture previously on Faisal, we talked about Lawrence, T.E. Lawrence, and the Arab Revolt and his relationship to Prince Faisal. This is a very popular film which has shaped people's perception of this conflict, and it's obviously a Hollywood dramatized version that one should take with a grain of salt. However, it was based on actual historical events. And the context of this is that in a world that was predominantly, and I'm perhaps saying this oversimple, but I don't want to belabor this. We want to try to keep this brief. The context of this is that the Arab world was at this time a world that was predominantly tribal in its social forms of organization. And there's a very famous scene in this film where Lawrence has to convince one of the tribal leaders whom he wants to have join him on the taking of Aqaba in southern Jordan, to taking it from the Turks, that he is an Arab rather than a member of a particular tribe. And in this scene, one of the characters, the leader of the tribe, says, well, "What is an Arab? I don't even know what an Arab is." And so there is what Al-Husri is really responding to here is the criticism of some that it was the British who invented the idea of the Arab in order to unite the Arabs against the Turks, against the Ottomans, so that the British could then divide and conquer Turks or Turkish Muslims and Arab Muslims from one another in their efforts to colonize the region. Now there is some truth to this, that this indeed happened, that it was in the interest of the British to create, and the French as well, to create this idea of an Arab. But that doesn't necessarily mean then that there's no such thing as an Arab. And I think this is Husri's point. Now, in the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, in the aftermath of the fall of the Ottomans in this region and the coming of the French Mandate and the British Mandate and the taking over of the colonization essentially of this region, it is true that this led to a colonial period, which was a stain on the region until the Arab people in this part of the world, the Syrians, Jordans, and Lebanese, and so on, Iraqis, were able to rid the region of these European colonizers. And so this is what he's responding to, but he's saying, the British did not invent the idea of the Arab. This is false. The Arab is much older than the British. The British didn't invent the Arabic language. They didn't invent Arabic civilization. There is such a thing as an Arab for Al-Husri. Okay, now before we go on and look at the ideas of Michel Aflaq and then Gamal Nasser, I want to just very briefly take a moment and look at some of the ideas of the Ba'athist Party that Michel Aflaq and others founded. Now, the Ba'athist Party flourished from 1947 to 1966, and you find instances of it in Iraq, Syria, and Jordan, Lebanon especially, but also even in Libya and some even Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. There were affiliates of the Ba'athists even in these Wahhabi strongholds. And the Baathists were a party that implemented Arabist, pan-Arab idealism, pan-Arab socialism in very pragmatic ways. Now, Saddam Hussein, for instance, was affiliated with the Ba'ath Party, as was, for instance, in Syria, you had the father and son duo there that also have been affiliated with Baathism, and that's the sort of the last right now. Syria would be the last stronghold of Baathism, with the Assad still in power there. But most Americans, for instance, have no idea what the Ba'athist ideology was. So I think, since Saddam Hussein was such a prominent target of United States foreign policy in the years of George Bush and the years of Bill Clinton and the years of George W. Bush, I think it's important that Americans should know what it was, in fact, that U.S. foreign policy was targeting at this time. Now, this is not to necessarily to defend a figure like, say, Saddam Hussein, who was, sinister in his own way. There were many problems, obviously, with Saddam Hussein, but and one could obviously argue that Saddam Hussein was not an authentic representative of Ba'athist ideology. All of that, I'm not disputing any of that. All we're doing here is trying to get a clear sense of what the actual ideology really was. That's our goal here. Now, we don't have time to go through the whole Constitution, but I just want to bring out a few principles of the Ba'ath Party Constitution. And the first principle, one that certainly is akin to the thinking of Faisal, is that the Arabs form one nation. This nation has the right to live in a single state and to be free to direct its own destiny. The Arab fatherland constitutes an indivisible political and economic unity. The Arabs alone have the right to administer its affairs. Now, this is a key principle. It's for a good reason. The first principle, there's another lecture in this series on Theodor Herzl and Zionism and how Herzl saw Jewish sovereignty as being the answer to the problem of anti-Semitism that it plagues the Jewish community. And again, this is essentially the same thing. So what is being said here is sovereignty, that the Arabs are a sovereign nation, an indivisible and sovereign political entity. And this is the key. If you don't know what sovereignty is, you need to learn. And this is what the Ba'ath Party is asserting, that the Arabs are an indivisible sovereign nation. Now, the concept of sovereignty itself historically has implied indivisibility. This is one of the things that theorists of sovereignty have insisted, although more contemporary thinkers on sovereignty, like, say, Jacques Derrida, for instance, have argued that sovereignty is divisible, but the principle of sovereignty resides in its indivisibility, regardless of, let's say, more contemporary deconstructive view. The party of the Arab Ba'ath believes that freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of belief, as well as artistic freedom are sacred. Okay, that's a very important point. Freedom of speech. This is something that I think most Americans can identify with. This is in our Constitution as well, although it doesn't necessarily imply a separation of religion and state in quite the same way that the American Constitution does, but it does underscore, this Constitution, the principle of free speech. The party of the Arab Ba'ath believes that colonialism and all that goes with it is a criminal enterprise. The Arabs must fight it with all possible means. So it's a decolonial movement. It's an anti-colonial movement, one that flourishes in the aftermath of European colonization, specifically British and French colonization of the Arab world. The party of the Arab Ba'ath is a socialist party. It believes that socialism is a necessity which emanates from the depth of Arab nationalism itself. Now, this is an important point. The early Zionist movement also had links to socialism. This was prior to a lot of the ideologies that developed in the 20th century were prior to the Cold War. But we live at a time in the United States when political leaders are still often demonized by with reference to the S word or socialism. But the Ba'ath Party had no problem affiliating itself with socialism. This is also one of the reasons why during the context of the Cold War, many of the states of the Arab Ba'ath Party found sponsorship with the Soviet Union at a time that Russia the Soviet Union was a socialist state, if it ever actually was a state, because USSR never really declared its boundaries in any Republican nationalist sense. The Arab Ba'ath Party decides in favor of the struggle to gather all the Arabs in a single independent nation. All right, so you might think here of, like Fanon, for instance, in Wretched of the Earth and Dying Colonialism, will speak of the United States of Africa, this idea to bring together all of the African states, much in the same way that the states are gathered together in one sovereign nation in the United States. And it's a very similar idea, this idea of forming one nation, perhaps with different states, but a single nation. And so this idea of sort of, you think of a United States of Arabia. This is that's perhaps an oversimplification, but this really was the idea: one strong nation that is an Arab nation. Now, we've seen this already in Rabbath and in Faisal and other places, but the official language of the state, as well as that of all the citizens, is Arabic. An Arab is he whose language is Arabic, who has lived on Arab soil, or who, after having been assimilated to Arab life, has faith in his belonging to the Arab nation. Again, it says nothing about blood here. It says nothing about a metaphysical racial essence. One could be, for instance, Circassian and Arabic in this sense, or another ethnicity. It's not a matter of racial essentialism, and it's not a matter of blood, as it is, say, for instance, the case of Nazi Germany when Hitler spoke of Aryan blood. This is quite simply an Arab is one who speaks Arabic and has lived on Arab soil and assimilated to Arab life. And the Arab woman enjoys all rights of citizenship. That's an important point, the equality of all Arab women in the Ba'athist constitution. The party seeks to develop a general national culture for the whole Arab fatherland, which shall be Arab, liberal, progressive, extensive, profound, and humanist. I think that's quite interesting as well. Separation of the classes and differentiation among them are abolished. And so the goal is to overcome class divisions so that all citizens enjoy equality within this one single independent nation. Now, the key architect of the Ba'athist movement in terms of its philosophy or its ideology is Michel Aflaq, who lived from 1910 to 1989. And he was a very interesting figure. I don't want to go too much into his biography here. We're going to focus here particularly on his ideas themselves. He was a Christian, however, an Arab Christian. And it's interesting to note that many of the key figures in the Ba'athist movement were not Muslim. They were Arab Christians. Christians form a minority in the Arabic world. They're a significant minority. Now, there have been there's been a significant dwindling of a Christian presence in the Arab world. This is, again, another consequence of the Bush wars on Iraq and Syria, for instance. But many Christians, it was not a sectarian movement in the sense that there were divisions between Christians and Muslim, Christians, Sunni, Shiite. The idea was, now in practice, it did happen that these divisions arose, but the goal was to overcome these divisions and unite all peoples around this idea of a shared Arab identity, rather than, let's say, one's particular dogmatic affiliations or how one interpreted the Abrahamic religion that one might happen to profess. And here you'll find Aflaq saying something that's quite interesting and may surprise you even. He says, the nationalism for which we call is love before everything else. It is the very same feeling that binds the individual to his family, because the fatherland is only a large household and the nation a large family. Nationalism, like every kind of love, fills the heart with joy and spreads hope in the soul. He who loves does not seek reasons for his love. If asked to explain it, he cannot account for it clearly. Love, O young man, before everything. Love comes first, and the definition follows. Now, this sounds quite Christian, and again, Aflaq was Christian. So what is he talking about? Charity, Christian charity? Is that the kind of idea of love that he means? I think that might be partly what's going on here, but I think that it's perhaps more accurate to think of this, say, if we compare this, say, to Rousseau's social contract. One of the points that Rousseau makes is that in a republic, for a republic to flourish, the citizen must be what Rousseau calls virtue. Now, virtue is the love of citizen for citizen, which is comparable to what, say, in philosophy is called philos, brotherly love. That the love for Rousseau that one should have for one's fellow citizen is akin to the love that brothers might have for each other. And this is why we get in the French tradition and the French Republican tradition, this insistence on liberty, equality, and fraternity. Fraternity is necessary. Now, of course, that's a very gender-specific notion, but love in this sense is concern, care for one another, for one's fellow citizens within the nation. That's basically the idea. One must love one's fellow citizen. Nationalism is spiritual, Aflaq says, and all-embracing, in the sense that it opens its arms to and spreads its wings over all those who have shared with the Arabs their history and have lived in the environment of their language and culture for generations, so that they have become Arab in thought and feeling. There is not fear that nationalism will clash with religion. It flows from the heart and issues from the will of God. All right, so that's not an atheistic assertion, obviously. And this is, again, one of the reasons why I say when we think of the Pan-Arab movement, I think it's better to think of it as an ecumenical movement rather than a liberal movement in the strict sense. But he's insistent that, this is very, optimistic in that there should be no reason if one exhibits one's love for one's fellow or professes one's love for one's fellow citizen, there should be no clash with religion, he's going to insist. And again, as we've already seen in other theorists of the Pan-Arab movement, it's not really a matter of racial or blood identity. It's a matter of language and shared cultural experience. Aflaq says, by revolution, we understand that true awakening, which it is no longer possible to deny or doubt, the awakening of the Arab spirit at a decisive stage in human history. The reality of the revolution lies in this awakening, the awakening of the spirit, which has been weighed down by stationary and vitiated or spoiled conditions. The spirit at last senses great danger, fateful danger, and rises up decisively. And so this is a spiritual revolution. This is not, when he speaks of revolution, it's not necessarily a militant revolution in that sense, although it could lead to that. But what's significant is the question of the Arab spirit. This is again akin to the notion of Edmund Rabbath's notion of quoting Renan, that about the spirit being a day, or the republic being a daily plebiscite. It's something that has to be, it's a matter of spirit, something that has to be affirmed. The spirit awakens, and Aflaq is firm in his belief that there is such a thing as a common spirit shared among Arab peoples. Revolution, he says, is the opposition of truth to the existing situation. They ask us, brethren, what do you mean by the mission, the eternal Arab mission? The Arab mission does not consist in words which we proclaim. It does not consist in principles to be incorporated into programs. The living and true experience of our common life will bring us back to ourselves, to our living realities. The experience in which our struggle takes place is that of the Arab nation dismembered into different countries and statelets, artificial and counterfeit. Now, Aflaq is pointing to something that's true of the post-colonial world in general, and that is that many of the nations that we see today in the Middle East and Africa, for instance, were not created by Arab peoples themselves. The maps were drawn up by European colonizers, and they were drawn for purposes that suited European colonizers rather than the people who actually lived there. And the logic was often, as I've said previously, divide and conquer. Now, if we take the situation of the Kurds today, their lands were deliberately divided up into different, were apportioned into different nation states. The same thing happened to the Tuareg in West Africa. And a lot of the legacy, the conflicts that we have today are as a result of that post-colonial legacy of these arbitrary maps drawn by European colonizers. And so Aflaq finds this dismemberment to be unnatural, and a desire, Arabism is then driven by a desire to overcome these artificial states and countries, counterfeit countries created by foreign peoples, not by Arab peoples themselves. Now, these are the prominent figures who were the inheritors of the Ba'athist party ideology. Unfortunately, one has to admit, as idyllic as some of these notions sound, or these ideas sound, Saddam Hussein did many terrible things. Hafez al-Assad was a butcher in his own way, and he did oppressed many people. And so, one of the problems with the Ba'athist movement then was the way that it didn't live up to this ideology, that this high-minded ideology that it developed. So it starts with very high ideal aspirations, but when its implementation on the ground, it didn't quite live up to many of its ideals. Now today, Saddam Hussein was tracked down, was executed after his fall from power. Hafez al-Assad died, and his son Bashir al-Assad died in Syria. He's still alive. He's still in power there, but there's been a bloody civil war that's been going on for some time. This would be the last bastion of the Ba'athist movement today in Damascus, in Syria, where Hafez al-Assad's son is still in power. Now, I mentioned this in passing. I said at the beginning of this lecture that we think of 9/11 when the two towers were attacked. It's important to note that almost all of those, with the exception of one or two who were Moroccan, were all from Saudi Arabia. They were all inspired by militant Wahhabi extremism. They had nothing to do with the Pan-Arab movement whatsoever. And in fact, the Wahhabi movement in general, particularly the Al-Qaeda articulation of it, this extreme interpretation, which many Wahhabi in Saudi Arabia have sought to repress themselves, was profoundly hostile to Pan-Arab ideology. And so if we think of the thought of the figures that we've been looking at, Aflaq, Rabath, Faisal, and so on, that these thinkers would have all been deeply opposed to Pan-Arab ideology. And I think that's important to note, because when we think of George W. Bush, when he told the American people that essentially, I mean, I'm oversimplifying here a bit, but he convinced the American people that Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden were essentially in bed together. They were promoting the same cause. But in terms of their ideologies, it's hard to imagine two ideologies more opposed to one another. Saddam Hussein was the enemy of bin Laden. Bin Laden was the enemy of Saddam Hussein. But because Americans are so ignorant of the Islamic religion, of Arab politics, of the history of the Middle East, George Bush was able to convince a large number of people in the American public that somehow there was some connection or relationship between these two figures, which ideologically simply makes no sense whatsoever. Here's the gun of Saddam Hussein that Bush captured and proudly displays. I find this to be barbaric, but this was the kinds of things that those of us who lived through that period. I was living in Jordan at that time. Saw a lot of things that were very, very shocking, and that Americans, I think, in my view, have no reason to feel particularly proud about. Now, Gamal Abdel Nasser, he lived from 1918 to 1970, and we're coming to the conclusion of this. I just want to make a few brief points about Nasser. He was a very interesting figure. We're not going to do him justice here, but I just wanted to mention him to differentiate the articulation of Arabism that we find in Nasser's thought from, say, the thought of somebody like Aflaq in the context of the Levant. Now, Nasser was president of Egypt, and Egypt is not just an Arab country, it's also an African country. It's a Muslim country, it's an Arab country, but it's also an African country. And so this is the reality that Nasser was very much aware of. And so he wanted to, or he knew that if Arabism, if Pan-Arabist thought was going to take off in Egypt, it had to be adjusted to fit very particular Egyptian realities that makes the Egyptian situation different from, say, the situation in Jordan, Lebanon, or Syria. And so he wrote a book called The Philosophy of Revolution. It was published in 1956. I just want to point out a few points to this, and then we'll bring this to a conclusion. But there you can see Egypt on the map. And part of Egypt, the Nubian part, is you get deeper into the continent of Africa. It has a distinctly African culture and flavor to it that makes Egypt very different from the culture, say, of Jordan or Lebanon or Syria. And so, again, many Americans, they may conflate all these different countries together, but they're not, the cultures are not the same. And Nasser was aware of that. And so while he affirmed many aspects of political Arabism, he had to, again, adjust it to suit the realities of his own country. And so Nasser then will speak of the three circles that are pertinent to Egypt: the Arab circle, the African circle, and the Islamic circle. And he's going to say, as the leader of Egypt, he has to be cognizant of all three. He'll say, we cannot look stupidly at a map of the world, not realizing our place therein and the role determined to us by that place. Neither can we ignore that there is an Arab circle surrounding us, and that this circle is as much a part of us as we are a part of it, that history has been mixed up with it, and that its interests are linked with ours. These are actual facts and not mere words. Can we ignore that there is a continent of Africa in which fate has placed us and which is destined today to witness a terrible struggle on its future? This struggle will affect us whether we want or not. It is not in vain that our country lies to the northeast of Africa, a position which it gives upon the dark continent wherein rages today the most violent struggle between white colonizers and black natives for the possession of its inexhaustible resources. Now, while one might find it deplorable that Nasser is referring to the sub-Saharan Africa as the dark continent, nonetheless, he's very much aware that Egypt is affected by the struggles that are going on in Africa, and he sees himself in a certain solidarity with those people who are struggling to free themselves, black people in sub-Saharan Africa who are struggling to free themselves from the yoke of white colonial rule, the rule again of French, British, and other Dutch and other colonizers in Africa. Can we ignore, he says, that there is a Muslim world with which we are tied by bonds which are not only forged by religious faith, but also tightened by the facts of history? But there is no doubt that the Arab circle is the most important and the most closely connected with us. Its history merges with ours. We have suffered the same hardships and lived the same crises. And when we fell prostrate under the spikes of the horses of conquerors, they lay with us. All right, he's thinking, of course, probably of the Napoleonic conquest of Egypt as well. So he's affirming this African circle. He's affirming this, what he's calling this Muslim circle, which also binds Egyptians to the Islamic world. But he underscores the priority of the Arab circle, which he says uncategorically is the most important of all. All right, now these texts can be found in Sylvia Haim's Arab Nationalism, an anthology published in 1964. In my view, it's still the best resource out there. You can get it on, I think it's not too hard to buy. So there's these essays. There are other essays in there as well, which I definitely recommend.